Hi everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be discussing an intro to C# using ESAPI. So if you are new to ESAPI, then I have an introduction video. ESAPI is used in the context of Eclipse, which is a treatment planning software. And so if you're not familiar with that, then I'd encourage you to watch that. And ESAPI is short for the Eclipse Scripting API. So today we're going to be covering some of the basics of C#, and I have already created a C# project using the Eclipse Scripting Wizard. And if you're not familiar with that, I have another video that discusses how you can get started with Visual Studio, and we create our first script using the Eclipse Scripting Wizard. Just really quickly, I can show you what it looks like. It looks like this. Give me 1 second. Okay. So basically what I've done is I've created a single file plugin. I've named it and I've opened it. Well, I created it and then I opened it. So I have it open right here. And so let's see. So I want to start, in order to use ESAPI, so if you're trying to write scripts for your clinic or that sort of thing and you're new to ESAPI, then this video will hopefully help. Chances are if you're new to programming or new to ESAPI, then you may also be new to C#. So in order to be as proficient as possible when we start writing code for projects for the clinic, then we need to have a good solid understanding of some various basics of C#. And so at its very base, things are made up of different value types. So we may have bytes, which you really will only use if you're doing things with imaging. And then you have text, which is represented as characters or strings. A character is a single value, and a string can be made up of many values. Then you have numbers, which might be represented as an int, a float, a double, or a decimal. There's other types of numbers and floating point values that might be like longs and that sort of thing. But for what we'll be using with Eclipse and ESAPI, it will basically just be using ints and doubles. And just really quick, I have a note up here that there's a very good introduction to value types. If you want to go into more detail, there is I have it linked here, but there's a YouTube channel called Angel6, and I referenced it in the introduction video to ESAPI. But he has a C# mastery playlist, and one of the videos covers value types, and I have it linked right here. But you can just Google it, look for his channel, and I'm sure you'll find it. But he goes into a lot of very good depth as far as what the differences are for integers, floats, longs, bytes, s-bytes, etc. But essentially what it boils down to is that each one has to take up a certain amount of memory. So the idea is that you want to use a value type that uses as minimal memory as possible. So if you if you don't need something that's going to use as much memory as a long, then you would use a float or a double. And then the difference between floats, doubles, and decimals, besides the amount of memory that they take up, is how accurate that they are represented by the machine. It's kind of, if you're new to programming, it's kind of an interesting thing. But so decimals are mostly used with money, because obviously you need your financial processes to be as accurate as possible. doubles just aren't as accurate to as many decimal places. It's still accurate to, you know, a fair number, but when you're talking about financial transactions, you need that, you know, you need a much larger threshold of accuracy. So, and then after numbers, you have Booleans, and these are truth values, so either true or false. They're represented as bools, B-O-O-L. Then you have another value type that we'll use are dates. So if you're looking for like a creation date or, you know, history date, something like that with ESAPI, then we'll use things like date time. That's the value type for that. So just really quickly, thinking about Eclipse, let's use some of these. So like I said, you'll mostly use bytes with like imaging, so we won't go into that today. But for, let's say for text, let's say you want to know like a patient's name or a plan name. So you'll have a string, and so we'll go into this more. Well, we can go into it right now, but we want to create a variable. So we want to create a variable named plan ID, okay? And so you need to declare what type of variable it is. So, well, technically you don't have to. You could have a just a var, which is just this allows the compiler to determine what type of variable it is. So we could say plan name equals context dot plan setup dot name, okay? And then we could declare the plan ID as context dot plan setup dot ID, okay? So both of these are strings. So if we hover over this, we see that it's a class system.string. And then if we hover over var, it tells us that it's a class system.string. The reason that these are both strings is not because var is a string, it's because var is allowing whatever this value type to declare its value type at. It's allowing it to figure it out once it's been declared or once it's been made. So name is a string. If we hover over, we can see that it is an API data object. Well, that's the plan setup, but we can see that it is a string. That first value there, it says string. And then if you hover over, you can also see that it says get. So we're only allowed to get a plan name. Now the plan ID, it says get and set. So that means that we're actually able, if we have write abilities, so you can see up here, actually we won't see that yet. Eventually we'll see a line that says is write enabled true. And so what this set means, it just means that there are instances where we're able to declare or set a plan setup's name. So thinking about plan automation, you need to be able to do things like create a course, create a plan, give a plan its name, give a course its name, or I should say ID, because technically it's the ID property. All right, so we have to declare the value type. So these are strings, but then we also have a character. Okay, so, or actually, let's just say string random equal, well, we'll call it my string equals I'm a string. Okay, so, and the reason that this is squiggly is because it's assigned, but its value is never used. Okay, and the same is actually true for these. So it just means that we're not using it down here. So like we could say console dot write line my string, and now that squiggly goes away. Okay, so, and these are grayed out. They're not as blue as this one because they're not being used either. So Okay, so this is a string, and then if we have, so you can tell this uses the the double quotes. Now there's also single quotes, so you could say, like, let's say you wanted to write a string, and in some languages, if you're not familiar with C#, say like in Python, you can use single or double quotes, right? So you could say another string equals another string. Okay. Now you might notice that there's a red squiggly here. So in Python, if you're familiar, you can use, but in C#, the way that you differentiate a character versus a string, which is a bunch of characters, is by using single quotes or double quotes. So double quotes means that it is a string, whereas single quote, you can see it says struct system.char, right, or character. So if we change this to char or char, and we give it one value or one letter, then that is a character, okay? As soon as you give it a second character or value, then it's no longer a character. This would need to be a string, which is just a bunch of, well, this is squiggly, or it's throwing an error. It's complaining because we're trying to call it a character, but it had two values. So that's the difference between a character and a string. Okay, so we'll just get rid of these. Well, actually, let's just create a character. Oops. Okay, so you can see this string is still only one letter, but if we tried to call it that, it complains because we're using double quotes. Okay, so if you want to create a character, a single letter or value, like we could also use one is a number, right? But as long as it's wrapped in these single quotes, it's all it knows is if it's a character. It doesn't care what it is, right? As long as it's wrapped in single quotes. Okay. All right. So that's character. So that's text. So you have characters and strings, and then for numbers, we have the numbers that we'll use are like integers. So int, my int. Well, let's say like age, right? Equals 0. Well, let's say we're 10. Okay. Or maybe the patients, or let's say number of plans equals context dot plan setups. Actually, we would need the patient. Let's see, dot courses dot. We'll just say the first dot plan setups. Oops, dot count. Okay. So this would give us, if we look here, we can see that it says int. Okay. So what we've done is we've accessed the patient through the context, and then that patient has courses, and we've selected the first course, and then that course, so this is a course now, and then each course has a list of planned setups, or an IEnumerable of planned setups, and then we've requested the count of the, however many plans are in that particular course. So that is an int. So again, if we change this to var, we can absolutely do that, and it's still an int 32. So, or if we want to say int, we can say int. And then the other thing, if you hover, I don't know if you noticed that, but it said, there are different types of ints. So there's like int 32, int 16. But this just happens to be an int 32. I think that might be the default for int. So if we hover over here, yeah, so that's also an int 32. So the difference between an int 16 and an int 32, it just is the number of bytes that it's able to be made up of. So so we can declare an actual number, or a property of something else. So like this count method gives us the number, which is an integer, of the plans in that patient's course. Well, I should say first course. Okay, so that's an int. And then the other one that you'll see most likely is just double. Okay, so let's say we wanted to know the max dose to that plan. So let's first, so up here, what we've done is we've been using this plan. So instead of continuing to write all these things, let's just say context.patient. Well, let's just use plan setup. Okay. Oh, duh, I don't have an equal sign. Okay, so let's see. So now we can replace this with plan. Okay, and then we can replace this with plan. And there's a faster way that we could do that. So if I undo that, we could. Well, we actually don't want to do that, because then it would replace. We'll go into ways of replacing values in a quick way, later on as we're building projects and stuff. But basically, it's just a means of searching for all instances of a value and then replacing it. All right, so let's say we want to do the plan max dose. Okay, so we're saying that it's a double. We're just going to make that assumption, but we'll see that in a second. So plan dot dose max 3D. Okay, and then there's the dose, and then there's all these other properties and methods. So the number of decimals, so you can say the precision of the value, the dose, so that's the actual dose property, and then we can see the unit. So is it gray or centigray? We could say unit as a string, value as a string, and then you can see that this IntelliSense, because we have access to the DLLs, it's giving us some information. So it says the value of this instance is as a string, right? And one thing about programming, we'll get more involved, more into this as well, but you see that this property is named value as string, and then here in the description it says the value of this instance as a string. So when as you are developing things, one of the things that you want to think about is naming. We want to name things in a way that helps us and other people who might be reading our code. It helps us to remember and to know and to understand what something is without having to, or what it's supposed to do without maybe fully understanding what's going on. But anyway, we're going to access this dose property, and then if we continue, there's a toString, but we don't need that. So if we hover over dose, we see that it is a double. Okay, so if we weren't sure what it was, we could say var, and then it would allow the compiler to determine what value type it should be, represented as. So this is a double, and so we're just gonna say double. All right, and so that's how you might get the plan max dose. Okay, so if you're, with respect to ESAPI, you're probably mostly going to use ints and doubles. And then, okay, so after numbers we have booleans. So we might have, so these are true or false statements, or values. So you might say, you might want to know whether or not the dose has been calculated. So, like if you want to calculate the max dose to a structure or the max dose to a plan, then you need to know if this dose even is calculated, right? So you don't want your script to crash every single time that you run it, just because the dose hasn't been calculated. Because if you're just running a script, unless you have messages or throw the proper errors and that sort of thing, or exceptions, then the user, it might just crash and the user might have no clue as to why, or whatever. So you might want to check whether or not the plan's dose has been calculated. So we could say var plan has dose equals plan dot, and then let's just look and see if there is something that says is dose valid. So we could actually just type dose. Okay, so that's get dose at volume and get volume at dose, so that's useful to know later on. So let's just, is dose valid? And so if we hover over this, it says it returns the value true if the planned dose is valid. So this implies that the dose object returned from the dose property is not null and can therefore be used to query dose values. Okay, so this is exactly what we want. And if we hover over again, we can see that it is a bool. Okay, so we could, if we wanted to, we could say bool. Okay, so bool plan has dose, plan.is dose valid. Okay, so then the way that you might use this is you might say if plan has dose equals true, get dose stats here. Okay, so you might want to do something like that. And just really quickly, like you might have noticed, there's these 2 forward slashes. Okay, that denotes a comment. Okay, so if you ever want to leave a note or something, and we'll actually talk about this a lot, well, not really a lot, but we'll use comments a lot, because as you're writing code, your projects tend to get very complicated very fast, and if you take a break from your project, you may go back and look at it and be like, what was I thinking? Like, what am I even trying to do here? So writing comments is it's very good to get into the habit of writing comments. So like here, for example, you might want to write a comment that says plan, maybe current plan, in, or maybe something like plan in the current context, or maybe it's the selected plan, right? That way, if someone comes through and they're reading it, or they're reading it, or they're reviewing your code or something like that, and they read your comment and they're like, okay, this is what they wanted to do, and then maybe somehow, like maybe you used var and maybe for some reason it was accidentally changed to patient, right? And because we used var, it let us do that because now this var can be a patient, right? It doesn't care. But maybe you're going back through and you're reading your like maybe your script is crashing for some reason, and you're reading your comments and you're like, okay, this should be the plan, and I've labeled it plan, but for some reason it's been defined or declared as the patient. So there's a problem. Okay, so that doesn't make sense. This should actually be the plan setup. So now I can change that, and I can feel good about that, and I can continue. I could, find where this is used, and then figure out, what I'm supposed to do. Or maybe, this was, the comment was the current patient, right? And this was patient. But for some reason we've somehow accidentally labeled it as plan, right? So then we can say, okay, well, every time we're using plan, we think we're using a plan, but we're actually getting the patient information. So now we can come back and we can rename it. Okay, so those are some of the benefits of using comments. It's a very good habit to get into if you're new to programming, or even if you've been programming for a long time. It's very useful. So, all right, so that's Booleans. Okay, and so we could just add Boolean example, numbers. So common number examples. Alright. So these are common string and character. Well, we'll just say text examples. And we'll change this to the current plan. Okay. Okay. All right, so then we have dates. So let's say, let's get rid of that. So I'll actually go into the shortcuts, but if you saw, I just deleted that really quickly. I'll go into that more in depth in just a minute. But okay, so then dates. So let's just go ahead and add common date. Ooh. Example. So let's say we want to check whether or not the structure set that was used for the plan setup it makes sense, right? So maybe this is actually a plan check that Matt Schmidt used in one of his examples. So like let's say we want to make sure that we want to know when the the structure set was created, right? So let's say we want to grab the structure set, so var, I'll name it out, structure set equals context dot plan setup dot structure set. Whoop. Sometimes the IntelliSense kind of gets you. Okay, so so then we want to know var created date equals structure set dot, let's see. So it might actually be part of the, let's see, create, oh, history date time. So it might be that. It has the image. So maybe we want to know when the image was created. Yeah, so the image has a creation date time. Okay. So, and it's labeled date time because the variable is likely a date time, right? And if you notice, so this is actually a good example. If you notice, the date time has a question mark after it. So what that means is that it can be null. Okay. That's actually a good, that's probably a type that we should add, and that's null. I don't really know if it's an actual, I I don't know if it's an actual value type, but it's more. I wouldn't say it's not really a value type. It's more of a. So I won't put it there, but it's more of a value that a type can have. So something can be null. So in other words, if it doesn't exist, right, then it's null. And if you remember when we were looking at this dose, this is dose valid, it actually says that the dose, it's checking whether the planned dose is valid, and then it goes into more detail where it says this implies that the dose object returned is not null. Okay, so we were checking to see whether or not the dose was null. So another way that we could actually do that is just add a question mark, which this doesn't allow it to, because this is actually let's see, what is this? So planning item dose. It may not be. It's not allowed to be null. So let's see. What's that? Oh, okay. So the reason why is because of this. Okay. So in other words, so by saying that it's a double, what we're saying is that it's going to return a double. However, if this dose doesn't exist, what it would actually return is a bool, or it might actually return null. So yeah, it would return null. It would return null. So what that's saying is that a double can't, without the question mark, can't be null. So it has to be of type double. But if we say double question mark, then that means that it can be null. And so that way, if this dose is null, it'll just return null, and that's fine. The other way around that probably would be bar, because then now it says that it is a nullable type, and that type is double. Okay, so let's remake this and see what it says there. So it just says struct double. Okay, so but by adding this question mark, we're making it nullable, basically. So so that's a good thing to be aware of as well, is that some items can be null. So you'll want to, when you're writing your code for your project, you'll want to make sure that you have the proper checks in place to account for when objects are null. Because like let's say for example, if you're familiar with treatment planning, you might actually have a clinical plan, right? And so that structure, it may not even have a structure set. And so if the structure set, if the plan setup doesn't have a structure set, this is actually going to be null. So then we're actually going to have an error because this structure set doesn't exist, and we're trying to access a property of that structure set. But that structure set doesn't exist, so therefore this is going to throw an error. Okay, so we don't have any. There's no warnings or red squigglies or anything. This is where debugging your code gets really complicated. Okay, so having the proper checks in place is very important. So yeah, so that's I know if you're new to programming, that's probably a lot to think about, but just don't worry, we'll cover things as they come up. But yeah. All right, so now that we've talked a little bit about that, so that's a date time, okay? And the thing about date times, I'll go into a little bit about that, is that it actually gives you both the date and the time. So if you wanted to say, message box, say you wanted to write out just the date, okay? And like maybe you want the date like in a good readable form, like month, date, the day of the month, and then the year. So you could actually you could actually write, let's see, created date dot toString, okay, and then if you add a lowercase, okay, so this, we actually need to access the value, and then toDate or toString, and then if we add this d, this lowercase d, it gives us a short date, and that's just the one that I'm familiar with using. So, but then there's all these other options as well. So you could say just D for the day of the week full. 3 Ds would be the day of the week abbreviated, things like that. And then just lowercase d is just short date, right? All right, so, and then you can tell there's tons of other options. So like seconds, let's see, the F for full short date time, full long date. Anyway, there's like the month, the year, things like that. So, but you could also access just, specific parts of that date time. So like, let's say you want to know the date, or maybe you want to know the day of the year, or maybe the day of the week, right? Was it simmed on a Monday? Was it simmed on a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, whatever? And then this isn't a string, so because it returns a day of the week, which is probably actually an integer. I can't remember if this returns an integer. It might be like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. Given, depending, 0 being Sunday, 6 being Saturday, and then you would say toString, because since that's a day of the week, then so let's actually check that, because so let's say day. This is just something that's interesting. So test equals, so that it's a type, so it's going to give us some option. Okay, yeah, so here, so it says Monday is 1, right? So if we wanted Monday, it would actually return 1. Sunday is going to be 0, and then if you're new to programming, so that's just something that's interesting. If you're new to programming, then we'll returns 0 through 6, okay? So then you would actually have to write, there's some really short ways that you could write this, but you could say, you'd have to write, if the, well, we won't go into that right now, because that'd be a lot of logic to write for each day, but you could say like, if the value equals 0, then return Sunday, right? But that's a good thing that I want to talk about really quickly is, if you noticed up here, I actually started with 0, okay? And the reason for that is because if you're new to programming, most of the things that will be, any sort of, if you need to find the index of something, or like where the thing is located within that object, like whether it's like the list, right? The first object in the list is at the 0th index, right? So, or index 0. So if you would let's say you had a list, then you would get at element 0 would be the first object in the list. So that's something that's important to understand if you're in if you're new to programming. Okay, so all right, so that's the various value types, and this video is already pretty long, so I'm gonna stop here, and in the next video I'm gonna cover some I'll pick up from there, and I'm gonna cover some basic Visual Studio shortcuts, and then I want to talk about some things to consider when writing code, and then I want to go into a little bit of basic detail. It's going to be more in depth than you probably need in order to really get started, but it's going to set up sort of like my vision for the programs that we write. I want us to write code that is clean, that is reusable, and I want to use best practices as much as we can. Now, there's going to be times where we just need something like quick and dirty, and we're just going to write it. And a lot of times you'll write something, and then you'll go back, and then you'll clean it up, or whatever. So anyway, I want to talk a little bit about that. So until then, hopefully this will give you some information that you could use to start playing around with scripts in Eclipse. And until next time, thanks everyone. Hope you have a great day. If you want to follow along, then be sure to like and subscribe so that you'll be notified when new videos come up. And so until then.